How we doing, ladies and gentlemen? My name is Samantha Christine, and today we're going to learn about the 6 elements of art. Today we're going to go over the different ways that they can be used to create each other, what each one specifically is, and fun facts about them all. To start off, our 6 elements are line, value, color, shape, space, and texture. So I'm going to go get set up, and I'll meet you back here in just a moment. Alright guys, so our first element is going to be line, and I'm going to show us a few ways of how to draw them, things that they can show us, and how to use them in different ways. So first we're going to start by thinking about how to use your material differently. So in my marker here I have a larger side or a longer side and almost like a pointy edge. So using that point, I can get a skinny line. And I can also hold it on the flatter or longer side and get a much thicker line. So I can think about using this same technique of changing the way I hold my material. Even when I'm using a pencil, I can use the point, or I can kind of turn it to the side and almost use it to get that very larger, thicker line. You can also use it with a marker. You can think about using this with your paintbrushes, how to use the very point or a larger, wider side to create a skinny versus a thicker line. Now, a couple other lines that are very important are lines that show direction. And you might think, how can a line show direction? Well, if I wanted to draw something like waves, that's one continuous line, and it shows us that the waves are moving to the right. It's showing that the movement is going in that direction. Now, movement is another thing a line can show that we see here in the water. It doesn't show a flat, very still surface. It shows maybe something that has an arch, maybe there's wind blowing. So that's a line that can show direction, and it also shows motion. Now, an easier way to show motion than using such a stiff line could be maybe something like this, where your pencil almost lifts up off of it, or your pen almost lifts up. I'm not using a lot of pressure on this line, where these ones I pushed harder so that the line was more controlled. Having a softer, less controlled line can also help show motion in your drawings or in your paintings. Other ways that lines can help us is by overlapping them. You can start to increase the value in that one area. And as you move away from the darker areas, you could use less lines, less overlap, and you can use small, quick little motions to increase the amount of lines you have in one area, showing value from our darkest to our lightest side. And that can be used by overlapping our lines. Now, another way that we can use our line is how or which direction we draw it in. So if I have a line that moves top to bottom, it shows that something is either growing really tall, maybe something is falling, but there's motion and direction from the top to the bottom. Now, our line that moves left to right shows something maybe flat. Like I said up here, it almost looks like a flat surface. This would be our horizon or a horizontal line, where this would be our vertical line. Vertical line running up and down, horizontal lines running left to right. Now, to get a line that shows a little bit more direction or something that's outside of these would be a line or a diagonal line, excuse me. So a diagonal line would start and it would move to the top right, but it wouldn't be perfectly up and down, and it wouldn't be perfectly left and right. You want to start at one point, and instead of going up or to the side, you choose somewhere in the middle. Thinking about math a little bit, if this continued all the way up and this continued all the way to the side, we could see that that's not a perfect corner. Our diagonal line would then create a smaller section of space. So those are a couple different ways that we can use line. Thinking about what the other 6 elements are, we already know how it'll help us create value. If this is creating smaller space versus larger space, we can see how our diagonal lines will help us when we start talking about the element of space. So this is our very first element, and now I'm going to go over to our second one, which is value. All right, our second element of art is going to be value. And like we said earlier, when overlapping our lines, we can create value from our darkest darks to our lightest lights. So if I wanted to start with my darkest darks over here and my light ones over here, I would have to think about how can I fill this section going from darkest dark to lightest light. If I use those lines and I scribbled up and down, you can see that I need to push harder to get my darkest dark. So depending on what material you use, the pressure you apply to your paper can also increase your value. If I were thinking about those lines again, each line would need less pressure as I got to the lighter side of my value. And that means I need to stop pushing as hard, almost lifting my pencil completely up or my pen completely up off of the paper. We can now see how value goes from our darkest side to our lightest side, and our middle being somewhere in the mediums, that gray range. Now we also want to think that value can be held in any color at all. And once I go over color in the next section, we'll see how they kind of can play back and forth, but our value can be increased in any color at all. So if you were to think about doing blues, maybe your dark, dark navy blue would be over here, and then maybe a much lighter blue, a medium blue would be in the middle, and then almost a white, a whisper of a blue, like a baby blue, would be all the way on this side. And we can think about how adding black to our colors will make something darker, and how adding white to our colors can make something lighter. So using black and white in between our colors, like adding it to blue to create our navy blue or our baby blue, can change the value within that specific color. Alrighty, so our third section is going to be color, and here we're going to talk about what our primary colors are, how our primary colors can help us create our secondary colors, and a little bit about a color scheme or how to stick to a color scheme. We're also going to touch on how our colors can hold value again, because I think they work together very, very well. So first I'm going to go ahead, I'm going to grab our three primary colors. It's going to be yellow, blue, and red. Doesn't matter which one you start with. I have my yellow in my hand. So I'm just gonna go ahead, and if you're doing this activity with me, just go ahead and make a square or a shape of yellow so that you can keep note of which ones our primary are. Our primary I like to start with as our first ones because they are our most important, and without starting with our primaries first, we wouldn't really be able to get to many of our other colors. So I have my red, I have my yellow, I have my blue, and now I have my red. And these are our three primary colors. Now, to get to our next section, we have to think about how do I go ahead and get to my secondary colors. My secondary colors come second, so I want to remember that primary, most important, they have to come first. But I can think about how my yellow, blue, and red can help get to my next colors. If I took yellow and red and mixed them together, so yellow plus red, I would get a secondary color. If you want, you can try to guess what that color is now. If you already know, then go ahead and put that in your secondary color section. Now I'm going to go ahead and write out my second and third mixture. I'm going to think about taking yellow and blue. So yellow plus blue, that's going to equal a secondary color. And then my last ones that haven't been used yet will be my blue and my red. So how does my blue plus my red mix together, and what color will I get there? So I'm going to go ahead and grab my colors real quick, and I'll be back just to go over our secondary colors and a little bit more. Alrighty, so I went ahead, I grabbed my secondary colors. I am ready to figure out what primary colors mixed together will get me to my secondary colors. So I have them here. My secondary colors are orange, green, and purple. So if you've already done this step or you guessed and went ahead a little bit, I'm going to go ahead and think about how yellow and red can get me to orange. I'm going to put my orange in here now. And then I'm going to move on to my next one. Now I have yellow and blue. It's going to be another lighter color and another darker color. My blue and my red are much darker than my yellow. So I'm going to get green when I mix those two together. So I'll go ahead and I'll just put green next to that, and this will be almost like my guide or a little cheat plan type thing, because this will always be here for you and for me. So if I forget or I want to see maybe can I experiment and play with other colors, this can always be a nice reference for you to come back to. Now, thinking about how we took darker colors, our blue and our red, and mixed it with a lighter color, now I want to think about taking those last two colors, my blue and my red, my two darkest primaries, and mixing them together, and thinking about how are those colors going to turn out. Well, we already know our secondary color, our last one, is going to be purple. So purple is a result from mixing blue and red. Purple is typically one of our darker colors, so we can see how two dark colors created another dark color. All right, now thinking about adding these and creating these with different values, we would want to think about how we can take a darker color being black and mixing it to something and creating a different color. Now, I only have markers here today, so mixing my colors is a little bit more difficult, but think about using your paints in this exact same way. If you have a yellow paint, you can always add a little bit of blue to it if you don't already have a green paint. You can think about mixing more red into your blue to get almost like a maroon purple, purple that looks a little bit more red. If you have a purple that looks a little bit more blue, then maybe it had more blue mixed into it than red. Now, if you are using paints or watercolors, even colored pencils, you can go ahead and try to experiment with your mixing. If you were using markers, I did want to cover this so that you have a better understanding about where your colors are and how they are created. Now, one last thing I want to cover real quick are color schemes, and two that I really like to make sure I understand and I always know are my warm colors and my cold colors. So for my cold colors, I want to think about things that make me cold, or for my warm colors, what keeps me warm. Now, a good way to think about this, for me at least, is if I'm outside on a sunny day, the sun is what's keeping me warm. And what color is the sun? We all know that the sun is the color yellow, but maybe I were sitting outside by a bonfire, or I put my food in the toaster and those little burners turned like an orangey red. Then I can also think about how orange and red are two more of my warm colors. They typically are colors of things that will keep me warm, so I use that as another guide or reference to remember what my warm colors are. So I'll put them over here to the side. My warm colors will be red, orange, and yellow. And we can see how they kind of work really nicely together. They're almost like a little family, and that's one color scheme. Now, we also have our cold colors, and another way to think about this is if I were to imagine what a winter wonderland would be made up of if it were only colors, typically my brain would come up with white and blue. White and blue mixed together gives a very soft and almost a cold feeling. So if I can think of a winter wonderland with little penguins having blue bow ties and white snow everywhere, then blue might be one of my colder colors. If I can think of it in terms of that weather, blue would then be my coldest cold, it would be winter. Red, like my hot colors, that might be summer. So my winter, my coldest cold, my coldest color would be blue, and I'm gonna start that up here. So blue will be my coldest cold. Another way to remember your second two cold colors, especially when you have your reference right here, your reference key, you can think about if blue was already cold and I mixed it with other colors, what colors have blue in it? Where is that cold going? What other colors have that coldness? So I want to find where I have blue, and I can see I mixed blue with my yellow earlier to get green, which means green has to have blue in it, so it has to be a little bit colder than our hot colors. It does have that cold blue in there, so I want to make sure that green is on my cold side. Now again, looking back, we can see that red was mixed with blue. Blue, again, being our coldest cold, means that it has to make that red much colder also. So blue and red together give us purple, and that's going to be our third coldest color. So here we can see we have our primary colors up top. These are our primary colors. And then these ones right here, those are going to be our secondary colors. Again, these are our warm and our cold. And now we can kind of see how these colors all interact and how they can interact to change what they are, just like how our lines interacted with our value and how they can kind of build off of each other. Remember, every single one of these colors can also hold value as that blue gets darker or that yellow gets darker, and then compared to when it gets much, much lighter. I'm gonna go ahead and prepare for our next section, and I'll be right back. So our fourth element is going to be shape. And shape is kind of tricky, but I think it can be broken down into very easy ways to understand it. So if you were to think of what a shape is, most of you will first off the hand, like right off the top of your head, you're gonna think probably a square or a rectangle of some kind, maybe a triangle or a circle. And yes, they are all shapes, but think about shapes that you wouldn't typically see in a textbook or aren't so perfectly geometric. Think about shapes that aren't perfect shapes. What about the shape of a jelly bean or a loaf of bread? So if I have something like that or like that, are they still shapes? And I want you to ask yourself that. Is that still a shape? Once you have that answer, maybe you're on the fence. Yes, absolutely. Of course these are shapes. What a shape, all that means is that it's a line that is brought all the way around and it connects. They're not open. So if I had just that, that would not be a shape. That would be an arched line. Maybe you turn it into something else, but that by itself right there is not a shape until you close it. All of these are closed, so our shapes have to be closed. Now, these are all beautiful shapes. They're organic, some are geometric. We have perfect corners where our lines are pointed, and we have very organic, arched lines, almost free form. That's kind of how I like to call these shapes instead of little blobs. They're my free forms. These are all shapes, and right now the way that they are drawn are very flat. To me, when I look at this, if I colored this in, this entire circle just shows me that it's a black circle. There's nothing interesting to it. There's nothing behind it, nothing inside of it, nothing on the sides of it. The way that I can create a shape with space around it or space inside of it would then be how I rely on my other elements. So right now, taking your line, closing off a shape, one line, closed it off, that gives you a flat drawing of a shape. I want you to think about those lines we talked about earlier. In our squares, we have our lines that move up and down, and we have our lines that move left to right. Now, I did say earlier that when we talked about our diagonal lines, they can help us create space. So if we wanted to think about space inside of that object or having that object taking up space, we would have to think about creating a cube or turning that square into a cube, making it three-dimensional. So I'm gonna go ahead, I'm gonna start with my square down here. And that's all I'm gonna draw. I'm gonna draw my square and that's it. And so that you guys can see this a little better, I'm gonna choose to use a different color, but you don't have to. If you're following along, you don't have to change your colors. But now I'm going to think about taking this square and using my diagonal line to push something backwards into space. So if my diagonal line starts at a corner, it can't go perfectly up and down. I don't want it to go left to right. I want it somewhere in the middle. I'm gonna take that diagonal line and pull it off of my shape. Now, I don't have just one corner. I have 4 corners, which means I now have to do a diagonal line off each corner. And mine aren't perfect. They don't need to be perfect. But I still need to make sure that if I have 4 corners or 4 sides of a square, I need 4 diagonal lines all going in the exact same direction. So if this was my square, I wouldn't want to have 3 going back and 1 coming forward. How am I going to connect those 3 to this one? So down here I have 4 diagonal lines coming off of the corners to my shape, all going in the same direction. And now I can go back and think about how can I connect them. Now, what's also cool to realize is this almost looks like a little fallen over table. If this was the table top, these are the table legs. If the table has 4 sides, 4 corners, the table needs 4 legs. 1, 2, 3, 4. Your diagonal lines would become the tabletop's legs. And if it fell over, they all go back in the same direction. So think about that also, if that helps you picture where your lines need to go. But all you need to do now is find your 4 new corners where those diagonal lines stopped and draw lines to connect those black dots. So I need a line going left to right at the top. I need a line going left to right at the bottom. I also need 2 lines, one on the right going up and down, and one on the left going up and down. And now we can see how this shape, which was once a very flat drawing of a square, has now created space inside of the object. There's space all along this side. We can see that it's not just sitting on a table and it stops right there. That square now has created space between whatever it is sitting on. All of this now is space that these diagonal lines have helped us create. Now I'm going to do one more shape and turn it into a 3-dimensional shape, and I hope you follow along. After I do that, I will be switching over to our next element, but I do want to show that even if it's not a perfect square or a triangle or a circle, that even our free forms, those blobs that don't have perfect corners, how they can even be turned 3-dimensional. So I'm going to recreate one of my blobs, just really easy, down here. All right. It looks interesting. That's all right. So where would I start here? Where would I take those diagonal lines and start to push space off? If this was my top left corner up here, I want to think, where's my top left corner or farthest top left that I could go? And that might be somewhere in here. So I have my side at the top, and maybe instead of moving to the right-hand side like I did in this square, I'll show us going to the left-hand side. So this is the direction that I now need to go in. I want to go to the left. See how they're different directions? I'm moving something in a different direction with the use of my line. So I have my first point, and now again I have to drop down and find my second bottom point. That's going to be somewhere in here. And I don't really have anything in the top right. I don't have much in the bottom right either. But I do, this little corner, I guess I could add a little something. So those are now my points. I want to think about those diagonal lines. And this is the easy part again. Once you have your points, you just want to take a diagonal line moving backwards, not perfectly straight up and down, not perfectly left to right. Now, I added that third point. I'm second guessing it now, so I'm just going to forget about that. But we can still see how our 2 diagonal lines over here have our top and our bottom. And if I think about the 2 we had back here and how I just drew that line straight down to connect it, I just have to think about mimicking the line I have of my shape. So my square was straight, I have to mimic the straight side in the back. If this is kind of arched or a jelly bean, I need to now arch it like a jelly bean. And now here we've created space within this object. We can see that now it is a thick object. It's not just flat, it has a side, and it would probably have a thick side all the way around. So again, using those diagonal lines, moving objects backwards into space, helping them look like they are occupying space. We can see now how our elements are starting to play together, how our lines helped our value, how our lines helped our shapes, or how our value can be seen in our colors. So our next one is going to be space, and we can start to see how a little bit more of these elements really come together and help create space overall in an entire drawing instead of in just one singular object, which is what we saw here. So I'll be right back, and I hope you'll stay tuned. All right, guys, so here we can see that I've drawn out a couple different images. and that we are going to be talking about the element of space. So here I want us to think about my drawing of Bob. He's going to be my little helper today, and his house that's way far away. Now if you are basing them on size, Bob is much, much larger than his house. And I want you to ask, how is it possible for Bob to be so large and so tall and still fit in a house that is so little? How do you think that's possible? If that house is so far away, it's so small, can we think about different ways that things are small when we see it with our eyes? So if I were standing at my house and I looked down the block and I looked really far down the block, would the houses down by that stop sign down really far away, would they be smaller than the house I'm standing next to? Does distance play a part in the sizes we see? I want you to think about those things and tell me, can Bob fit inside of the house? I want you to answer that on your own. If you think yes, yes. If you think no, no. But I don't want you to think you're wrong. I want you to just kind of test yourself. Can Bob at this size, being larger than my hand, fit in his house that is barely as big as my thumb? And as you think about that, I'm going to draw 2 diagonal lines. Okay, and I want you to think about how those diagonal lines help give you visual guidance, or a line of direction, and how it can show you where he is compared to where the house is. So I hope you're still thinking about it. I'm gonna go ahead, I'm gonna draw these 2 lines real quick. From the very front of his house, all the way down, oh, I don't wanna cut him in half, all the way down past him. That's 1 diagonal line, and I'm going to take this one down too and bring it just a little bit this way. So if these are my 2 diagonal lines, you might ask me, well, they're not perfectly diagonal, Miss Sam, Miss S, whatever you kids are calling me. You'll see that there is a little bit of an arch, that it does curve a little bit. So compared to those short diagonal lines like this that we saw earlier, we can see that they aren't perfectly straight, that they almost even come down a little bit before they start to arch. So can this still be a diagonal line? It might not be a perfect diagonal line, but this arch going all the way back and moving all the way back on both sides shows the direction of our diagonal lines. So now that I have his walkway, his sidewalk, we can now see that his diagonal lines walking are pushing backwards into space. They're creating space from where he's standing right here on this side of the sidewalk with all this grass over here. He's standing up front. And as these diagonal lines get smaller and smaller and they push backwards into space, we can see how things that are farther away need to be smaller in distance, and things that are closer up have to be larger in size. So we want to think smaller in distance, larger close up. We can see this because of the use of diagonal lines on the 2 sides of him, and also the use of size in the shapes of the houses and in Bob. If Bob was much smaller, that space would be harder to create between him and the house. So we want to think about that when we're drawing images as well. Diagonal lines can create a 3-dimensional object, but they also can help creating space between 2 objects, between 2 things in your drawing, pushing something farther away and helping bring something much closer to you. We also want to call these 2 things our background, and I'll write that up here. Our background and our foreground. Our background is something far back, it's far away, and our foreground is something that's brought forward, it's closer to us. So keep those things in mind. Diagonal lines are very, very powerful. They help us in many, many ways. We also have things that are smaller in distance, larger close up, creating a background and a foreground. So now that we have space covered, I'm going to go ahead and set up for our very last element, which is texture, and I'll be right back. All right, ladies and gentlemen, this is our last element out of the 6 elements of art. It is texture. Now, texture is something similar to space. It kind of depends on all of the other elements. We can see all of the other elements usually being used to help create our textures. So I'm going to go over 2 different ways, and I'm going to try to use as many of the elements as I can. So I'm going to keep my colors separate in the color schemes. Again, I have my hot colors and I have my warm colors. I'm going to be doing 2 textures, one in the cold colors, one in the hot colors. So I'm going to do my cold colors first. And I want you to think about texture again using all of the elements. I'm going to start by using line. How can I use line to create a texture? First, I want to ask you, what is texture? Is texture something you can feel? Is it something you only see? Is it something that's really, really rough and coarse? Is it like a brick wall or the scales of a fish? I want you to think about these things as I talk about how line can help us get there. So for our first texture, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to repeat the use of line. So earlier when line helped us with value, we overlapped, and now we're using a patterned use of line or a repetitive use of line. And I'm going to do fish scales for our first one. So I'm going to start with just a line, because notice it's not closed, it's not the perfect shape. And that's going to be the first one. And I'm just going to keep arching so that it looks like a pattern of that same line. And as I do this, I'm going to drop down. We can think about how this use of line has now created a shape underneath where before it was left open. I kind of have like a diamond into a raindroppy shape here. And as I continue doing this, creating a shape an overlapping shape, creating a repetitive use of line, I'm creating a texture. And now I already told you that we'll be using color in these textures. So we'll see how color can help create more texture, more value, more space between these fish scales. So we've used line, and because of line, we've created some shapes. We've repeated them like a pattern. So we want to think about those things that help us get to texture, repeating things like a pattern, using our lines and our shapes. And now I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to take my lightest color first. And I'm just going to color in just a little bit of each. They don't have to be every single one. It doesn't have to be perfect. But I'm going to color in most of these fish scales with a little bit of that green. And this is going to start giving color to that texture. You can also see that those squiggly lines, they're not perfectly blended, they're not smooth, it doesn't look very soft to the touch. These scribbly lines also can give the scales, which is the texture I'm drawing, texture themselves. It'll make them look a little bit rougher. And now I'm going to take my blue and I'm going to only use it on one side. I'm using a colored line, that's 2 elements in one, and I'm just giving a little bit of an accent on one side. And we can see how this almost starts to build up the value as those blues overlap the greens. Having the blue all on one side, I'm keeping it on the left side of every scale. I'm repeating what I do to one in every single one. It kind of starts to build up that maybe it's shining, maybe this side's catching light and this side has a shadow now. I'm going to go ahead and add my last color to this texture, and maybe I only want to put it where those pieces are overlapping. So I'm not going to add any up top because right now there is no overlap, but in all these extra shapes, I can start to find where this scale moves up underneath this arch. Because it's going underneath like a fish scale would, that'll create just a tad bit of a shadow. So I can start to add all of those. Again, I'm not scribbling in the whole thing, but just adding that little bit really brought this texture to life. It makes it look rough, it makes it look like there's overlap, that there's a little bit of roughness to each scale, in addition to if I ran my hand against this and if it were a real fish, all of these scales would also feel rough and coarse like the actual texture. So that's texture one. That is our first way to use texture to create a scaled, rough, tough texture. Now I'm gonna go ahead and do one more, again, trying to use as many elements as I can to create this texture. I'm going to use a brick wall, like I mentioned earlier, is another beautiful way of texture. But instead of just starting with line, how I did here, how I started with just that arched line, I'm gonna start with a closed-in shape. And we all know that a brick wall usually has rectangles or some sort of elongated square. Maybe they're not perfect rectangles, but they do repeat. All of those squares line up, and then they kind of drop down. And just like these did, they overlapped. It started in the middle and then it overlapped the next one. Again, thinking about how I can use these full rectangular shapes to overlap and repeat them in a patterned way. I can see now that maybe I have a full textured wall, and I can even make it look like broken up where some pieces maybe aren't connected. So this is my brick wall. This one didn't have an immediate use of line, but you have to remember you're using line to help create your shapes. So I've repeatedly used my shapes here, and I'm gonna go in with my warm colors, which are going to be my red, orange, and yellow again. I'm going to start with my darkest color, which is going to be my red, and using my lines going back and forth can help make sure that these shapes are kind of staying true to what they needed to hold. I wouldn't go in here and do loop-de-doos like that because we know that the brick wall and that these shapes are moving left to right. So I'll use left to right lines instead of these green ones being up and down. These scales moved up and down, I color up and down. These are moving left to right, I want to color left to right. So I can keep adding these. I won't do every single one, but you get the idea. You want to start with your darkest color, and then maybe I can go and use my oranges up and down now. So I changed the way my line is going, the direction of my line, and then I'm going up and down to create some shadow, some depth and kind of bumpiness to those bricks. And I can add all that there. If I wanted, I can always take my yellow and do the same thing on this side, going up and down to give a darker side versus a lighter side versus a darker side, creating value within the bricks. Again, your colors can hold value, your colors can overlap. And now we can see how using all of our elements can come together to create each other in addition to helping them create maybe just one thing. Our lines can help create value when you overlap them like I did here. Our colored lines can help bring life to our images. And we can see how all 6 elements, as elementary as they are, really can come together to help create beautiful pieces of art. So this was the 6 elements of art. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you got so much information from it. And I will be back soon to give more at-home projects and lessons.